ensuring the security of the network early on versus giving people the ability to zap in and out of things more dynamically. So there are different ways to play it. And if you're thinking about the 100% about the security of the network and the decentralization of the network, not implementing that could theoretically be a good play early on. I don't know.
Is it safe to say that none of us are worried about the centralized nature of PulseChain? Because that would be a kind of joke.
So people talk about that because of the OA and the OA's token supply. But again, that actually doesn't introduce centralization to the consensus model itself, because the consensus model relies solely on the validators. So when you look at other blockchains, validators all have to come to a consensus, which is just a mutual agreement to halt, stop, or roll back the chain. That's how centralization happens on the blockchain itself. And we can't have that in PulseChain because you're talking about hundreds to thousands of validators. So you cannot stop PulseChain. Once it starts, it's unstoppable. And the other aspect of PulseChain that, for me, I'm looking forward to is it's not solely reliant on AWS. So say we had AWS taking care of PulseChain's validator system and node network. That means you're solely reliant on centralized servers, and they can flick those servers off at any time. You're talking about Richard Hart, who looks to mitigate every single aspect like that. So you're talking about a blockchain that's going to have thousands to hundreds of thousands of validators. So it's a digital ledger technology that is now truly unstoppable and unforgeable. You cannot make any changes to that digital ledger. You cannot enter censorship, and you cannot undo something. It's truly decentralized and not reliant on a single server. So they have the ability to spread PulseChain over thousands of different servers. So if one server goes down, 10 servers go down, you are not going to affect PulseChain. You cannot stop it. And that's what the new consensus model allows for PulseChain. It allows for a truly decentralized, unstoppable blockchain. So the centralized aspect comes into token supply. And again, I spoke about this earlier, where you now have the ability for a chain to be deployed with thousands of validators already in place, not solely reliant on the community and network participants to dive in. Because if you pre-deploy a blockchain with hundreds or thousands of validators running already, you now also mitigate 51% attacks, because this isn't a well-established chain. This is a brand new chain. So there is a bunch of aspects that you need to mitigate in the early days, including the servers that you're running off, and 51% attacks is another one. So now you have the ability to deploy a truly decentralized blockchain, not solely reliant on servers, not solely reliant on trying to rush out as fast as you can to mitigate 51 and eclipse attacks on the consensus itself. You're launching a chain that's ready to go, unstoppable and unforgeable. And then you also run into many different aspects, which is some of the things that I try to talk about on my Twitter. And I know it's obviously striking a little bit of controversy. Some people maybe not necessarily understanding me in short form, where you want to incentivize further validators to participate in the network. And yes, that means that they have to run hardware. And yes, that hardware costs money. And yes, there is penalties involved with being a validator. But say you were to 2x or 3x the block reward compared to ETH, you're further incentivizing people to actually move over and become network participants in PulseChain to further decentralize our chain, which is the whole entire point of PulseChain, to be a truly decentralized network. Okay, and then block rewards is obviously a really important thing, but then there is also the fact of the hardware, and then there is also the fact that you need to consider everything that implies when you actually run that hardware. So there is slashing. So you need to make sure that your validator is running perfectly. You need to go through all the pros and cons of actually being a network participant. So there is also in Ethereum's consensus model right now, if you're running a validator, there's penalties. So say that your validator got called for being next in line to push forward and run the execution layer to authenticate a block. If your validator is offline, you actually suffer penalties. So your stake is then eaten into. So there's slashing, there's penalties, and there's different aspects being a validator that actually has cons against it. But there's also a lot of pros. And a bigger pro would be to further incentivize block rewards. But I just want to pivot off this topic because we have talked about it quite a little bit. And I actually have a question in my DMs by somebody that doesn't want to be known. And that's about what is ratio trading. So ratio trading What's going to be in the first few days of PulseChain's launch before Richard or before the devs actually deploy the bridge. And ratio trading is effectively just trading in Pulsex with no dollar value against it. And it also, one thing to consider when people are actually ratio trading is it has no effect on price, no effect on what the price will be when price discovery happens, no effect on anything to do with price. It's just pure speculation and ratio trading, allowing people to have an opportunity to maybe get a hold of assets that they want at a certain time. But ratio trading opens up a lot of variables, and it is extremely risky if you don't understand what you're doing.
I'm just a pleb, but yeah, ratio trading is basically, trading without knowing the prices. You just have to look at how many tokens of X, of that I get for what I'm selling, right? And you just have to go in relative value to each other. It's kind of like bartering, without having any dollar amounts to translate things into a common value system. So if you go to a swap meet and you've got seashells and someone else has rocks, and you're trying to barter between the two of them, how do you know how many seashells equal one rock and vice versa, right? You have to kind of agree on those values, and some of that is perceived value versus defined in some arbitrary standardized unit, right? So we're just used to seeing everything in US dollars. But in reality, if you look at how these decentralized exchanges work, more often than not, at least in Pulsex, we know for a fact in Uniswap V2, there are two-sided liquidity pools that pair two assets together at a certain ratio. And the ratio of asset A to asset B determines the value between them. Now, the fact that trolling through all the different pairs in the DEX, we can figure out the USD value of at least one thing. If we can do that, chances are we can figure out the USD value of everything, right? So if you know the value of ETH or Pulse, then everything in that DEX could theoretically have a derived value, right? So until that, though, when PulseChain launches and does not have a bridge out to another chain, and there's no other way for you to buy Pulse outside of the blockchain itself, there literally is no USD value. There is nothing that has value to compare it to because you cannot swap between these things. So you have to look at, if I give up so many units of token A to get so many units of token B, is it worth it? Are these four shells worth one rock to me, right? So if you want to give up one wrapped BTC and you're going to get 5 million Pulse or something like that, I'm just making up these numbers, but you get the idea. Does that number make sense to you? And you have to basically make some guesses in your head as far as the arbitrary value that you want to place on the thing that you're swapping for. Are you getting the value that you feel is fair? Now, the reality is, though, in the end, when a USD value actually becomes applied to these things, only then will you truly see, did you choose wisely or did you choose poorly, right? So that's where a lot of people will say you can get ultra mega wrecked if you're ratio trading and not really doing your analysis and your research and really being sure about knowing what you're doing, right? Because if you don't have that idea of where are you, and if you swap one thing for another, are you truly going to end up with what you wanted to get out of that, right? So for anyone who wants to try it, best of luck. It's going to be a free-for-all those first few days. You got to pop your popcorn and be ready to watch the show, because when PulseChain launches, we're going to see a lot of insanity. And, some folks who, decide to just wait it out and let the dust settle and then figure things out from there, slow and steady wins the race more often than not. And that might actually be the smartest play for most people, unless you're willing to take those chances and potentially lose what could end up being significant value. So you have to be smart, and you have to be willing to take the risk, and you have to be comfortable with the risk level involved in.
Crypto sloth.
Very well said.
I wanted to address the question because Katie, I heard you mention Pulse Hot List earlier, and so I don't think this gets talked about enough. And since we're specifically talking about PulseChain, I was wondering and curious what people's vetting process were for products or projects, said projects that are launching on PulseChain. Like I know there's Pulse Hot List, like I said, and I did an interview this morning with someone that does like there's a launch pad. I want to know what your guys' thought is with launch pads, if that's legit, not legit, etc., and kind of like how a newbie and someone who's not super diverse knows where to get their hands in. And we know Hex, we know Pulsex, we know PulseChain, we know Hedron, we know Icosa, we know some of these staple ones that are here. We know the Maximus DAO. So I just in general was curious like what your guys' thoughts were for that, and kind of recommendations that people should do when they're researching into PulseChain.
Vetting processes are extremely difficult if you're a noob and you don't necessarily have enough technical understanding. So Pulse Police, I believe, is quite a reliable source that a lot of people turn to when new tokens are deployed. But when you're actually looking at PulseChain, you're not just talking about PRC20 tokens and just a smart contract. There's a lot of applications that are being built. And a lot of these applications aren't just straight forks. A lot of them have made additional implementations. So when you're talking from like a noob's perspective, there's a lot of aspects that you need to look into. Like, do they need an oracle for their protocol? If they do have an oracle, does that oracle have its own service? If it has its own node service, are they being participants in that node service? Are they running multiple nodes with multiple feeds of data to make sure that that data feed is reliable, that it's not able to be manipulated by other people participating in the consensus? Are the changes that they're making to their protocol parameters, or are they state changes within the contract's logic? Because state changes affects the whole entire application and how it works. Meaning that you have to go back through the whole entire code structure and make sure that you haven't broken things. If it's just additional parameters allowing for, like, say, different tokens to be added, then that's just a parameter which doesn't affect the state's logic. So if that application was running successfully, it's not going to have any issues. So when you're actually talking about things, it's difficult. So Ethereum right now, the foundation is Ethereum Foundation are actually supporting builders and developers to use upgradable contracts. For me, I'm not the biggest fan of upgradable contracts, but I understand why, because some of their EIPs actually are breaking applications that are on the blockchain currently. Upgradable contracts is just the ability to put a proxy contract in front of it, which pulls the prior contract's logic and then adds additional changes. But if proxy contracts aren't deployed properly, it allows for people to actually take custody, so to speak, of that contract address, and ownership is probably a better word, which allows them to act maliciously. So upgradable contracts are scary. Contracts that have self-destruct buttons. Some developers like self-destruct buttons, but for me, they're scary again. So for instance, if you had a DAO that was deployed and that DAO had a self-destruct call function, essentially that's a call function that actually allows for that smart contract to be destroyed, removed off the blockchain entirely. And if you had a self-destruct button in a DAO, for instance, they get to predetermine where the contents of, say, that treasury go once that call function's called. So a DAO can hold millions of dollars with a predetermined address, and they just call the self-destruct function. And then now you have a full-on rug with a predetermined address that just rugged you. So, like, there's a lot of things when you're actually talking about verifying applications, not just tokens.
So just to finish that up, then, how much weight do you put on audits, and when people load up on audits, how much weight does that carry for you?
So I'm a strong believer in audits, but you actually need to check that audit yourself. So an audit is just a dev checking another dev's work. But if you actually don't verify that audit was done, not that it was done. If you don't verify the audit itself and what came back in that audit, so for instance, somebody can say, yeah, my application was audited, but it had a bunch of red flags and they didn't make the changes that audit required. They're just saying that they've been audited, but they actually didn't fix it. And then say that they were audited, they fixed those changes, but then they didn't get additional audits on top of that. Now you're talking about, again, something that hasn't been properly audited. So if they get audited, red flags appear, they make changes to compensate for those, and then they get audited again, and then you check that audit and it comes back with standard, maybe there's a little red flag here, but it's not anything that's going to actually affect that application. It's just a little red flag. Then, that's an audit that is worthwhile. That's an audit that's trustworthy. But to just say that I've been audited, everything's fine, isn't necessarily true. You need to do your own research and actually check what that audit is.
Well, you also want to know the quality of the company doing the audit. Especially, both of us being on a dev team ourselves, looking into, who to hire for auditing various different types of projects. There's a vast difference in quality. And some of the names that you see out there as the de facto standards aren't always necessarily the best quality. It comes down to the knowledge and skill set of the individual who is actually the one doing the audit, not the brand that is actually the one being paid for the audit, right? Because when it's all said and done, it's up to that person to read the code and identify the holes and the gaps and maybe even inefficiencies and point those things out to the team. And to Katie's point, it is up to the team to work with that auditor to then say, okay, these are the 10 things you found. This is fine. We resolve them. They go back, they verify, yes, these things are resolved. We're all good, right? But if they only just go through the first part and you don't get through the rest of the part, then you basically have a worthless audit. So, we've heard about audited projects being hacked and having funds stolen and being compromised in different ways. There's so many ways that a project can fail. Sometimes it's in the code where it can be exploited. In other ways, it is an administrative gap where maybe passwords for some specific protocol weren't protected the way they should have been. Or social hacking or other things, right? There's so many aspects here, and audit is one component. And that's the other thing I just want to mention is your web app, right? Your DApp consists of typically contracts that are running on the blockchain, a web UI that is accessing the contract and making those calls to the contract for you and displaying the blockchain data for you, so you can make easy decisions about interacting with it without having to go through the block explorer and doing it manually. Then certain applications may have backend servers that are off-chain. Okay, these are components that are outside of the Solidity code. They're outside of the contract, and that code is not there for you to review on the block explorer when you go look at the contract address there. So you want to look at a project holistically. Now, all these things are very technical in nature. So just to go back to your initial question, how do you vet a project? It comes down to what are your strengths and your weaknesses. If you're a very technical person and you want to get into the depths that we were just discussing, by all means, please go and review, do your own personal investigation, and just see if you can, get a feel for it and feel good about the project. Are they covering their bases? If that's not your bailiwick, maybe you're more social. You want to talk to the team. You want to get a sense of, are they answering questions? Are they supporting their community? Are they documenting their processes? Are they out there in front of things, or are they hiding, right? Some people, they want to see docs teams. Some people don't care about docs teams. Some people just want other verifications and levels of authority, like some teams go through a third-party KYC process, right? You need to determine what it is that you want to see out of a project and what gives you the level of confidence that you require to put your funds into it. And I would translate that into, what do I do in a traditional finance realm, right? Am I listening to, MSNBC all day or other, media telling me what stocks to buy, and they're the ones who are doing the research on listening to the quarterly updates. They're listening to, they're reading through all the published materials. They're analyzing what's going on in the companies. I've worked with folks who, were on the trading floor, who would actually go and visit the companies and interview, people within the companies to see what's the health of the company inside, because they were the ones putting ratings on these things and then broadcast out to their investors, right? So some of this is trusting knowledgeable people and maybe taking their word for it, if that's where you are. Some of it is doing the work yourself and investigating yourself. There's no one way to do it because it comes down to what is your knowledge. And to have you go read code if you don't know how to read code, that's a waste of your time, right?
Yeah.
So it comes
I
down to the
appreciate
user.
that answer, Long, and thank you, Katie. If there is anyone, in general, you guys can put it in the chat in the comments of a compiled list of good auditors. Maybe you guys could address that for people so people have more useful tools while they're vetting projects. Thank you very much.